We've been talking about colonial New England and how colonial New England was pretty much mostly settled by Puritans. So the Pilgrims being a group of Puritans who wanted to separate from the Church of England, and the Puritans themselves being a group of people who just wanted to make a better Church of England in America. And how they spread out in New England, how they created a public school system, and their economy and all these things that they did. Well, it seems like that New England is this one kind of area where everybody thinks the same way, but that kind of was and was not true. So the Puritans came over here because they were treated differently and unfairly in England and were allowed to practice their religious beliefs. So you would think that when they got to the New World and they had a chance to build a new society, that they would not do those things to other people because those things had been done to them, but that's not exactly true. They believed that their ideas of religion were superior, and so they did not get along with people who did not agree with them. And their schools were made to teach to read and write, but also to teach to read and write the Bible and their beliefs as well. So when people came into colonial New England who disagreed with them or who started to talk against some of the things that they were doing, the Puritan leaders in the Massachusetts Bay Colony did not like this. And so one of the reasons that people spread out in New England was because they needed more space and they spread out. But another reason that they spread out in New England is because they were forced out of the Massachusetts colony and had to go elsewhere. So today we're going to talk about a couple dissenters. And a dissenter is a person who does not agree with the commonly held opinion, and they have different ideas about things and why they should be done. The next guy that we're going to talk about, or the next person we're going to talk about, is a man by the name of Roger Williams. Roger Williams also didn't believe with the way that the Puritans were doing things in Massachusetts. He had a couple beliefs that weren't popular. One of them being that there should be a separation of church and state, because in colonial Massachusetts, the Puritans started the colony and the Puritans were a religious group. And so for them, church and government were very much connected. And it's not like that today. Today, church and government in the United States is not connected. And that's kind of the idea that Roger Williams had, that there should be a separation of church and state being the government, because the government shouldn't make laws about religion because then people wouldn't have religious freedom. And that was the problem in England. So he thought if that was the problem in England, we shouldn't do it here. And also that the state shouldn't tell people how to believe, but that the churches shouldn't tell the state what to do, because then you would have different churches arguing over who gets control, and that would all be bad too. So it's all bad stuff. So, and he also had a belief about the land that they were taking from the Native Americans. He thought that the land should be bought fairly from the Native Americans. Of course, what colonists considered fairly buying land and what Native Americans considered fairly buying land were two different things. But he at least had this idea that it shouldn't be taken, that there should be some sort of negotiation and better relationship with the natives. That basically got him kicked out. And he left to start the colony of Rhode Island. So he left with his own group of dissenters, of people who also disagreed, and they left started the colony of Rhode Island, which is why when you guys looked at the maps that showed the different religions, Rhode Island was colored in yellow, and it was practiced religious tolerance. So he allowed people of different, or Rhode Island allowed people of different religions to settle there. Colony was a woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was from England originally, like the Puritans, the rest of the Puritans who had come over. Her father was a minister in England, and he also disagreed with a lot of the stuff the Church of England was doing. And he taught his daughter to read, to write, and to think. And so when she came over to the colony, she continued to think for herself, and the Puritan leaders didn't like that so much. She was a well-respected member of her community. She had 14 children. She was married. She was a midwife, so she would help women deliver babies. But the thing that they really didn't like about her was that she would teach about the Bible in her own home. And it sounds like, well, Puritans liked the Bible and they liked religion, so why is it that bad thing? Well, the reason for them that it was a bad thing is because then the people were going to her to listen to for things about Bible and God, and not, maybe they were worried they were going to go to her and stop going to the Puritan leaders to the regular church. So she was preaching outside of the church. She wasn't a minister, and she was preaching in her home. And she was preaching things like, you didn't need ministers to tell you about the Bible. You could go in and read it and figure out for yourself. And they didn't like that. So even though they were teaching people in their colony how to read the Bible, they didn't like her telling people to read the Bible on their own and figure things out and not just listen to what people told you. So she kind of believed that some of the other things she taught, while they weren't bad, were different from what the Puritan leaders wanted people to believe and to understand. And she was teaching in her home, and she was teaching to groups of men and women together. So a woman teaching men, and they really didn't like that. They put Anne Hutchinson on trial, and she did a great job defending herself. But when it got to the end, she wasn't really willing to put away her beliefs, and she ended up being banished from the colony of Massachusetts. She moved to Rhode Island, where Roger Williams and his group had defected to, his dissenters. And she was there for a while. She eventually ended up in New York, where unfortunately she was killed during a Native American attack. So not only did Massachusetts get rid of people who were Puritans who didn't exactly believe like them, but sometimes other groups of religious people tried to come into Massachusetts, and they didn't like that. And one of those early groups who tried to come in was Quakers. And we'll talk more about Quakers when we talk about Pennsylvania. But there were Quakers who entered Boston, and they faced all sorts of hardships. They were beaten, they were accused of witchcraft, they were accused of carrying the plague, so deadly disease basically that killed many people over in Europe. They were imprisoned, they were beaten, they were, there's an instance where Quakers were hanged and basically forced out of Massachusetts. So the Puritans were not friendly to those who disagreed with them, especially in the beginning. Other dissenters that we should mention are not just other religious groups that came from England, but also when we learned about King Philip's War, King Philip was a dissenter. He didn't agree with what was going on, and he fought to change that, and unfortunately it didn't work out for him. So it was pretty tough thinking differently in colonial New England.